Morning. It's good to see you this morning. Good morning to those of you joining us on YouTube as well. The statement is one I believe we are all familiar with. Maybe it was said to us by a loved one. Maybe we read it on a Facebook post. Maybe it was on a bumper sticker on the back of the car in front of us. Whatever the case, though, the message was the same. Only God can judge me. Only God can judge me. A phrase which it turns out to be so common, perhaps you've even seen it on a tattoo, like this gentleman has on his arm. But whatever the case, regardless, I'm positive we're all familiar with this statement, right? We've all bumped into this statement or heard this statement. If for no other reason, then it seems to be sort of a particular favorite of our society today. And honestly, for kind of obvious reasons, right? Because let's face it, as humans, all of us hate the thought of being told we're wrong. We hate the thought that anyone might come up to us and correct us or tell us that our behavior is out of line or tell us how we ought to live our lives. Which is exactly what the statement, exactly what the phrase, only God can judge me, seems to sort of defend us against, right? That's sort of what it kind of insulates us from. So whatever nasty or judgmental thing someone might say to you, this phrase is a great way to kind of invalidate what they are saying. But perhaps best of all, it also appears to be a pretty accurate paraphrase of something Jesus himself says from our passage today in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, where we find Jesus saying, "Do not judge so that you won't be judged," which seems like a pretty clear warning to avoid passing judgment on the people around us. A warning Jesus immediately doubles down on by telling this rather ironic story about a man or a person trying to remove a splinter of wood, a speck of wood from the eye of their friend while they have a literal beam of wood in their own eye. The message is comical but clear. Judging others is the literal definition of hypocrisy. So don't do it, ever. And yet almost immediately, almost as soon as we say that position, that statement, that no judgment ever idea almost immediately runs into some pretty significant problems. For one thing, in the very passage where Jesus appears to be condemning judgment, he does a little bit of judging for himself. How else would he know about the beam of wood in someone's eye if he weren't passing some sort of judgment on them? Further, this passage appears to kind of directly contradict a significant number of other biblical passages that seem to sort of flow in the opposite direction. Passages like 1 Corinthians 5, for example, where Paul says, "For what business is it of mine to judge outsiders," this being people outside the church, "is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges outsiders. Remove the evil person from among you." Or John chapter 7, where Jesus himself says, "Stop judging according to outward appearances. Rather, judge according to righteous judgment." Or even a few verses after our passage here in Matthew 7, where we find Jesus warning his disciples to be on your guard against false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravaging wolves. You will recognize them by their fruit. All passages which clearly acknowledge the necessity and even importance of judgment in the life of a believer. So in light of all this, I think it'd be fairly understandable to ask, so what exactly is Jesus commanding us to do or not to do in this passage here in the beginning of Matthew 7? Which, if we think about it, as it turns out, is a really, really important question. Because as our society's love for this statement, "Only God can judge me," demonstrates, we live in a world where pretty much any sort of moral judgment towards another person's actions are strictly prohibited, are they not? We live in sort of a society and a context where sometimes even the worst sort of behavior is not only tolerated, but sometimes applauded and encouraged, all under the guise of avoiding judgment and accepting people for who they are. To the degree that when we come to a biblical passage like this, it can seem to sort of echo that don't judge propaganda we kind of find ourselves surrounded with all the time, making it difficult to discern what our response is actually supposed to be. Is there a place for judgment in our lives, as some biblical passages seem to suggest? Or, as others seem to imply, should we refrain from all judgment in the name of mercy and grace? These are important questions for each of us to answer, believer and unbeliever alike, because we see these questions and sort of the tug-of-war between them played out in our society around us on a nearly daily basis. Now, as many of you know, this morning is our 5th week in a series we're calling Great Questions, which we've spent the last 5 weeks looking at just a handful of the many questions that Jesus asks in the gospel. And here today, we're focusing on the questions Jesus asks in the very middle of this passage, in verses 3 and 4 of Matthew 7, where Jesus says, "Why do you look at the splinter in your brother's eye, but don't notice the beam of wood in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the splinter out of your eye,' and look, there is a beam of wood in your own eye?" These are the questions we turn our attention to this morning as a way to understand exactly what Jesus is commanding us to do. And so what we're really after this morning, what we really want to know this morning is specifically, what is Jesus forbidding us to do in these verses? What is Jesus commanding us to do in these verses, and why does it matter? Now, as we make our way to Matthew chapter 7, I want to remind us for the second time in our series so far, we find ourselves in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount being a 3-chapter-long collection of Jesus' teachings in the book of Matthew, beginning in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus says, Matthew tells us, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to teach them, saying. And for the next 3 chapters or so, Jesus will sort of provide a condensed version, if you will, a condensed description of how a citizen in God's kingdom should live. Sort of the rules, if you will, of what it looks like to live in God's heavenly kingdom. But in pursuit of this, Jesus will cover a variety of different topics. He'll teach his disciples how to pray, for example. He'll teach them how to fast or how to deal with people that are trying to take advantage of them. And throughout this time, he'll reinforce many of the Jewish laws that are present in his day. But he'll also significantly expand on some. He'll demonstrate that while the kingdoms of this world are very much concerned about our actions and behavior, the kingdom of heaven begins with concern for the inner workings of our hearts. That is, when we talk about the kingdom of heaven, we're not just talking about our actions that matter, but we're also talking about how we think and feel that matter. And this is a theme that we see reflected not just across the Sermon on the Mount in general, but we see it continue even here in detail in the beginning of this 7th chapter of Matthew, when Jesus turns his attention to something that seems to irk him in the life of the religious leaders and the religious people of his day more than anything else, something that he repeatedly warns his disciples to avoid, which, as we're about to see, is the hypocrisy of passing judgment on someone else without first examining ourselves. But the way Jesus chooses to do this, I think, is incredibly fascinating, and even reveals to us a little bit about sort of the character, or maybe, hear me out, even the personality of Jesus. I'll give you kind of a silly, easy illustration. As many of you know, and as my long-suffering wife would attest to, I am a bit of a sarcastic person. Okay, I'm trying to fight it. I know it's not necessarily a good thing, but a lot of my communication sort of comes tinged with sarcasm. Now, I'm learning over a decade plus of marriage that that's not a good thing. That's something I'm trying to reel back in. But a lot of my communication still has this present in it. And yet, when we look at verses 3 and 4 of Matthew 7, I think we get a similar sense of the sort of dry, witty, or maybe even ironic humor with which Jesus communicates. Because in verse 1, he starts with this relatively straightforward statement about don't judge people so that you aren't judged. Don't do it. But then as he begins to to illustrate the foolishness of being judgmental, he does so with this ironic story about a person with a wooden beam in their own eye. And literally the word he uses would be like the beam we would build a house around, like the central beam in a home. And this person with a beam, a giant wooden beam in their own eye, is trying to remove a splinter or a speck or a toothpick from the eye of their friend. And to some degree, this almost feels like a cartoon a little bit, right? Because the resulting mental image is comical to the point of being absurd. And of course, we know that Jesus isn't really concerned about foreign objects in people's eyes, at least not in this particular passage. What he's actually concerned with is the human tendency to minimize our own sin while magnifying the sin of the people around us. What he's really concerned with is our tendency to kind of play down our sin while making a huge deal about the sin of the people around us, something which I think if we're honest, we all tend to do. But there's a catch. There's a consequence for this. Because every time we pass judgment on others, we unknowingly, unwittingly, subject ourselves to the very same judgment. Jesus says this in verse 2 of Matthew 7, "For you will be judged by the same standard with which you judge others, and you will be measured by the same measure you use." And the rationale for this should be sort of obvious, because if we pose as judges, we cannot plead ignorance to the law we just claim to be able to administer, right? So as pastor and theologian John Stott once said, if you enjoy the role of judge, don't be surprised to also find yourself in the place of the accused as well. Something that he could be verbatim paraphrasing Paul, because Paul himself in Romans 2 says, "Therefore every one of you who judges is without excuse. For when you judge another, you condemn yourself, since you, the judge, do the same things." And for just a moment, I want us to focus in on Paul's word choice here of that word condemn, because it's a clue to what Jesus is actually forbidding in this passage. Now, the Greek word that Jesus actually appears here in verses 1 and 2 of Matthew 7 is the Greek word krino, which literally means to judge or to condemn. And it's precisely this sort of hypocritical condemnation that Jesus is taking issue with. Meaning here in these verses, he's not forbidding discernment. He's not forbidding discernment. He's forbidding criticism motivated by condemnation. He's forbidding criticism motivated by condemnation. This is what he's telling us not to do, externally or internally. Because remember, throughout the Sermon on the Mount and in our passage, we see that it's not just what we do that matters, it's also what we think and feel which matters. So what Jesus is forbidding us from doing is striking a posture of condemnation, literally, externally or internally, towards someone we deem to be more sinful than ourselves, someone we think less righteous than us. And we see a painfully clear illustration of what this looks like in a parable Jesus tells in Luke chapter 18. It's in Luke chapter 18 that Jesus tells a story of two men that go into the temple to pray. Two men that it turns out could not possibly be more different. One of the men, Jesus says, is a Pharisee. He's a religious leader. He's a man that teaches the law. He's a man who appears, who we would guess, has a great relationship with God, a close relationship with God. And one of them, the other, is a tax collector. Meaning in the time of Jesus, this is a man looked down by everyone. A man who has made a living off of stealing from his friends and has profited from the subjugation of his nation. A man who would be viewed as a thief, a coward, someone with no moral compass whatsoever. These two men go into the temple to pray, but Jesus tells us what they pray reveals something significant about what's going on in their hearts. Because the religious man stands up in the temple and says, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, the greedy, the unrighteous, the adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week. I give 1/10 of everything I get." The picture of a parent righteousness, right? He's doing everything he's supposed to do. But the tax collector, Jesus says, stands far off, won't even look or raise his face to heaven, but instead beats his chest and says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. To which Jesus makes the shocking proclamation, I tell you, one of these men went home justified before God, and the other did not. Meaning the religious leader, the very person who thought he was right before God, was proved a liar by the hypocritical condemnation which consumed him, by the deep despise he felt for the sinner next to him. And the painful reality is that we often do the same thing. We do the same thing every time we are more angered by other people's sin than we are embarrassed by our own. The great German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer once shared a statement, made a statement that I wish, to be honest, I had never read. He said, the first sign of spiritual maturity is frustration with the hypocrisy of fellow believers. The hypocrisy in the church. And I have to think, one of the reasons I wish I had never read this is because can't we all relate? You don't have to go to church long, right? It's not hard. We can all relate to that feeling. Church is hypocritical. The people at the church are hypocritical. You don't have to hang out at church long to go, yeah, that's kind of true. That's the first sign, Bonhoeffer says, of spiritual maturity. But you know what he says the second one is? This is the part I wish I'd never read. He said the next sign of spiritual maturity is the recognition that same hypocrisy is present in ourselves as well. And if you're anything like me, that's a painful quote, because it reminds us that every time we're quicker to be outraged by someone else's sin than our own, we're following the example of the Pharisee in Luke 18. Every time we refuse to forgive someone because of what they've done to us, every time we refuse someone's attempts to find forgiveness, every time we gossip or speak about someone behind their back, we commit the same sin as the Pharisee in Luke 18. Most importantly, every time we act as if we're the ones who get to decide who gets access to God's mercy and who does not, we commit the same sin. Every time we act like we are the gatekeepers. Because the truth is, at its core, our condemnation of other people is no more than a thinly veiled attempt to play God. That's all it is. It's a sorry attempt to set ourselves up in the place of God. N.T. Wright, the New Testament scholar, said Jesus, in talking about this passage here in Matthew 7, says Jesus doesn't mean that we shouldn't have high standards of behavior for ourselves or our world, but that the temptation to look down on each other for moral failures is itself a temptation to play God. This is exactly what Jesus is forbidding in this passage by reminding us we aren't the judge. God is the judge, and every one of us will one day stand before him, a fact we would all be wise to remember. The words of Jesus from Luke 6, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven, because the standard to which you hold others will be the same standard to which you are held. All of this, though, might begin to sound eerily similar to that phrase we began with this morning, that only God can judge me phrase. I mean, that sounds like what we're sort of saying here, right? That sounds like kind of what we're affirming. God is the only judge. And the truth is, this is why I think that phrase, only God can judge me, is such a misleading phrase. Because like all the greatest lies, there's a kernel of truth to it. God is the judge. And we are not. And we would be wise to remember that. But if we're honest, this isn't really what people mean when they use that phrase, is it? That's not precisely what they're saying. Rather, what they're saying is, because God is the only judge, you have no right to correct me. That's what they're saying. They're saying, God is judge, so you have no business correcting me. You cannot pass any sort of moral judgment on my life or upon how I choose to live my life. And our society will point to verses like Matthew 7:1 and say, see, the Bible agrees with me. The Bible itself says this. But it's a lie. Because just as Jesus clearly forbids criticism motivated by condemnation, he also clearly commands correction motivated by compassion. He commands us to correct one another from a place of compassion, which we see in verse 5 of our passage when Jesus says, first, take the beam of wood out of your own eye. Then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. And this is significant because the whole point of this ironic story is not to say, stop worrying about your brother, right? Rather, it's to say, think critically about your own sin first, then move to correct your brother. Consider for a moment the well-known story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. It's a story many of us know, and it begins, we're told, as Jesus is teaching in the temple one day. And in the middle of his teaching, he's interrupted as a crowd of people, a crowd of the religious leaders, haul this woman before Jesus. And they force her to stand in front of him, stop derailing what Jesus is saying, interrupting the whole scene. And they say to him, teacher, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? Now, in the margin of the story, we're told the truth is they care nothing about justice. They care nothing about right and wrong. They're just trying to trap Jesus. But his response stuns everyone. Because rather than answer, he stoops down and begins to write in the dirt beneath his feet. Just so strange if you think about it. And as they continue to press him, he just keeps drawing away on the dirt. And then finally, when they won't let up, he stands up and he says, okay, the one without sin among you should be the first to throw a stone. We might say the one who's innocent, the one who's dealt with their sin first, go ahead. You condemn her. To which the crowd grows strangely silent. And in the minutes that pass, the men that have hauled this woman slowly begin to turn and walk away. Beginning, interestingly enough, John tells us, with the older men. As if the life experience there has changed their perspective. So one by one, these men sort of slip away until finally, at the end, it's just this woman standing there. Just this woman and Jesus. And Jesus looks over to her and he says, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And for the first time in the story, the woman speaks. You can imagine, still frightened, she looks around, she says, no one, Lord. And Jesus replies, incredibly, neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, do not sin anymore. Which, if we think about it, is a pretty mind-boggling response, is it not? Because there's no debating what this woman's done is wrong. There's no debating that what she's done has violated God's commands. And yet, Jesus has not condemned her. How is this even possible? But at the same time, what does he do? He acknowledges that it's truly sinful. That's what go and sin no more means. It means even though he doesn't condemn her, he acknowledges that what she's done is sinful, which is so critical, I think, for us to grasp. Because like we said earlier, we live in a society that would have us believe right and wrong are things of the past, that they don't exist, would have us believe that loving someone means cheering them on no matter what they do. My friends, that's as crazy as saying if you really loved your kid, you would let them play hopscotch on the freeway. It's ridiculous. Of course that's not true. Of course that's not loving. Any more than lying to someone and pretending their actions don't have consequences is loving. It's the furthest possible thing from love. But look closely at what Jesus does. He corrects this woman without condemning her. He corrects her with compassion, not criticism. Exactly how we too ought to respond to the hurting people around us. By caring for them, and in so doing, proving the authenticity of our love. Early church father John Chrysostom described this attitude perfectly, I think, when he said, correct the sinful person, not as a foe, nor as an adversary extracting a penalty. It's not your job to punish someone, but as a physician providing medicine. Meaning we ought to correct someone with the goal of healing and restoring, not pushing farther away, not extracting revenge, not getting even. Something we can only manage to do when we are careful about examining our own motivations. By asking ourselves, is this the standard that I would like to be held to? Is this the level of grace that I would like to be shown? I don't think it's any coincidence that just a few verses after the conclusion of our passage, Jesus says, therefore, whatever you want others to do to you, do also for them. For this is the law and the prophets. Which means in the context of our passage, means when we go to correct someone, we need to test our own hearts first. We need to see if we're really acting in love. And we must do so carefully. Because the scary truth is we have become adept. We have become adept at faking compassion when we're really just about condemnation. We know exactly the right words to say, the right sort of Christian buzzwords to say to make it sound like we're trying to be compassionate, when the truth is we're just out to condemn. We say things like, I'm only telling you this because I love you. Isn't that a great phrase? I'm only telling you this because I love you. You know, if someone says that to you, what's the next thing out of their mouth? It's probably not going to be that loving. That's why they prefaced it with that. We say that, and then everything that follows that is just aimed at hurt. Another favorite, bless their heart. We talk about someone, right? We could say whatever we want about someone behind their back as long as we tag it with bless their heart afterwards. Like it changes anything about what we just said. All this despite Scripture's command, brothers and sisters, if someone is overtaken in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual, what? Restore such a person with a gentle spirit, watching out for yourselves so that you also won't be tempted. That's how Jesus wants us to correct people. Thus, in the end, we see that Jesus' words here in Matthew 7, this command to judge not, it's not a requirement to be blind. It's a plea to be generous. It's not a denial of right and wrong, but a call to act with compassion. And perhaps by far most importantly, it's a call to follow the example of Jesus, is it not? Who did exactly this. Who left his throne in heaven not to condemn the world, but to save it. Came not to pay us back, but to pay for us. To shed his own blood on our behalf, taking all of our sin, our brokenness, all the judgment that we had incurred, bearing it to the grave with him, rising victorious over it, beginning the greatest restoration project the world has ever known. One that we miraculously are called, invited to participate in by being the witnesses, the recipients, and the bearers of this mercy. Not by sacrificing truth in the process, but by passionately proclaiming that truth in love. So as disciples of Jesus, let us find great joy in showing the same compassion we have been shown to the people around us. And let us consider carefully the true motivations of our heart when we go to correct someone. Because the standards by which we judge other people are the same standards by which we will be judged. Therefore, let us be a people of mercy, restoration, and healing, just like our Savior. Would you pray with me? Almighty and merciful Heavenly Father, we acknowledge the great mercy and the great grace we have been shown. We acknowledge that without it, without your compassion, all hope was lost. Father, would you move in our hearts that we might reflect that same compassion, that same mercy and grace to the broken world around us. Not sacrificing your truth in the process, but aiming for the restoration and healing. Aiming for wholeness and salvation, just as your Son did. In whose name we ask all these things. Amen.